Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this evening's event. My name's Paul Kizik. I'm the Group Chief Executive of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and the Joseph Rowntree Housing Trust, and it's my huge pleasure to welcome you this evening to the second in our short series of events being held with our partners and friends at Prospect Magazine to mark 100 years since the death of our founder, Joseph Rowntree. Joseph Rowntree lived at a time of profound change, economically, technically, socially, politically, a period of time we often look back on now as a sort of deep transition in our political economy. Joseph himself and his son, of course, were all involved in building piece by piece what became the modern welfare state. Roll forward 100 years, and today at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, we tend to see ourselves in a period, a similar period of deep transition, or at least we think we should be in a period of deep transition, where we lean into the challenges economically, socially, politically, and of course ecologically of our own time. We do that in various different ways within the organisation. We look to shift the terms of the political debate, and hopefully this evening we'll make a small contribution to that. We look to fund and support and shield the pioneers of today who, a bit like Joseph Rowntree, are trying to build the future in the present. And we also look to build the infrastructure for transition. So whether that's fresh insights, whether it's growing imagination, whether it's building grassroots movements and power, the ingredients we think we need to shift to a new political economy. And if you want to find out a bit more about our work, I should have a card in my hand. I have failed to put a card in my hand, but I have kicked over a glass of water instead. But there are cards that are available to you which will take you to more information about the work of the organisation. Now, about 20 years before Joseph Rowntree died, he wrote a memorandum which set out what he believed the organisations founded in his name should take forward. And in that, he encouraged us to focus on the deep structural issues, the underlying causes of social injustice, rather than what he called the superficial manifestations. So issues around wealth and power and the nature of the economy. One phrase you will not find in that memorandum, of course, is gross domestic product, because the modern concept of GDP didn't come into being until at least 10 years after Joseph Rowntree's death. And so Joseph Rowntree was operating at a time before GDP. This evening, we are going to go beyond GDP, and we're going to focus on how we can rethink economics with lessons both from the UK and in the US. The eagle-eyed amongst you might have noticed from the screens that we have a slight change to the itinerary. Very sadly, Felicia Wong has been taken ill and is unable to join us this evening. We are, however, extremely lucky and very grateful that her colleague and friend Todd Tucker will instead provide the opening remarks before we get into the broader conversation. And on that note, I'll hand over, I think, to Alan to do some formal introductions.
We're very pleased to be partnering with Joseph Rowntree to be doing this series. And to be joined by Todd. What time this morning did you learn the bad news that you were going to have to step into the...
About 3 or 4 hours ago.
That's 3 or 4, all right. So it's not even this morning, this afternoon. That's fantastic. But you could do it in your sleep, can't you? Yes, good. He is the Director of Industrial Policy and Trade at the Roosevelt Institute, where he's at the forefront of rethinking the role of the state in shaping the economy. He's a political scientist by training. His work explores how both national and international institutions can drive or hinder economic transformation. You may have read his writings in Politico, Time Magazine, Democracy Journal, the Financial Times, or the Washington Post. Ever been in Prospect?
Not yet.
Not yet? Okay, we'll remedy that tonight. He's also the author of Judge Not, Politics and Development in International Investment Law. That's Judge Not, K-N-O-T. A sharp look at how global investment rules shape development, and of influential policy reports such as in Industrial Policy 2025, bringing the state back in again. He's also played a key role in the Biden-Harris transition team, advising on commercial and trade issues. His speech is going to be followed by a discussion with Jane Green, Professor of Political Science and British Politics at Nuffield College, University of Oxford, and Alfie Sterling, who's the Director of Insight and Policy at the JRF. But first, please join me in welcoming Dot Tucker.
Well, thanks so much, and thanks to the organizers for both inviting Felicia and then accepting me as a replacement. I hope to do some justice to the theme of this panel, which is figuring out how to make economic policy more fair in an unfair time. I want to organize my comments today around sort of three key propositions, and then sort of give you both the argument for and against each of them, okay? So I'm going to be giving a U.S. perspective today about sort of the turn in economic policy that we've seen over the last 5 years, starting in 2020 and 2021 with the Biden campaign and then Biden administration, and its proposal around what it called, depending on the polling of the day or that month, either middle-out economics or a little bit more cheekily Bidenomics at times. And I want to basically give you the arguments for and against the following. Was it effective as policy? Was it popular? And then kind of what comes next looking forward. So to start with the first proposition. Well, first, let me actually just give a little bit more of a definition of what middle-out economics or Bidenomics was about. It was essentially 3 planks of policy that broke with what the administration, and many others, scholars, would call a more neoliberal approach to policy. These 3 planks were the following. 1, worker empowerment. 2, promoting competition and opposing monopoly power in the economy. And 3, public investment. How did each of these planks materialize in policy? On the worker empowerment front, we saw the first time in U.S. history that a president walked a picket line of a union that was striking, the United Auto Workers, against the big 3 auto companies. We saw this in a lot of regulatory changes at the National Labor Relations Board that reinterpreted some longstanding regulatory understandings to put the finger on the scale in favor of workers trying to organize unions and trying to get collective bargaining contracts. And then we saw this probably most importantly in the macroeconomic policies represented by the American Rescue Plan that was passed in early 2021, which injected over $1 trillion into the economy and created a wide range of social safety net programs, largely distributed through state and local governments across the U.S. And that promoted, and very intentionally, hot labor markets, tight labor markets that gave, in turn, workers some of the best opportunity in decades to seek better work environment, better pay than they had been getting. The second plank, competition. This was a return in some ways to an older U.S. tradition that was associated with Louis Brandeis, a Supreme Court justice and also prominent political economy thinker of the early 20th century, whose interpretation of antitrust law went far beyond just limiting prices for consumers and sort of collusive behavior to increase prices, but also just saw in general a problem for democracy of concentrated wealth and concentrated power, and made attempts to, especially in the tech sector, to sort of break up and in the finance sector as well, avoid some of the abusive charges that had sort of proliferated in the financial services sector. This was associated with important regulators of the last few years, like Lena Khan at the Federal Trade Commission, Tim Wu, a Columbia University academic focused on tech sector regulation, and Rohit Chopra at the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. And then the third plank, public investment, was based on the idea that after decades of disinvestment in the real economy, engagement with share buybacks and other financial activities, and offshoring of production, that it was important to have the public sector step up and make some investments in the real economy through a variety of different policies, most notably the Inflation Reduction Act, which was earmarked at about $369 billion of spending for clean energy. Other estimates by the private sector suggest it'll ultimately be $2 trillion of investment in clean energy production. Also the Chips and Science Act, which made tens of billions of dollars of investment in the semiconductor industry, and the bipartisan infrastructure law, which took after many decades of disinvestment in infrastructure and public goods, saw one of the biggest building, series of building activities since the Eisenhower era in the 1950s. And this was associated with folks like Brian Deese at the National Economic Council of the White House, who gave many speeches on this topic, Jake Sullivan at the National Security Council, who also gave many speeches on this topic, as well as maybe lesser known people, but still important, like Jigar Shah at the Loans Programs Office of the Department of Energy. If Felicia were here, she would have also described a lot of these for the moral dimension that each of them took on, in addition to the policy dimension, and in their effort to reduce inequality and make for a more sustainable environment. So I will just tease that and encourage you to also look at Felicia's own writings for some of these questions. So to get to sort of the first provocation that I wanted to address, was this effective? I've given you some sense of what it was, what some of the magnitude was. What was it effective? I think the argument that it was not effective, I would refer to you Jason Furman, who was President Obama's chief economist. He wrote something called the Post-Neoliberal Delusion in Foreign Affairs back in February of this year. And he made a series of points. One was that this Bidenomics or middle-out economics spent too much money and then triggered inflation. That there was too much focus on manufacturing when it's not any longer as important a source of jobs as it was 40 or 50 years ago. And then finally, that there was too many layering on of requirements on the public investments that were made through these clean energy and semiconductor investments. Requirements like that companies getting money should provide childcare to their workers, that they be rewarded for working with labor unions or paying prevailing wages, or that they attempt to engage with local communities where they're making these large investments to attempt to get community buy-in. And again, the argument here was that that layering on of requirements got in the way of project development and was ineffective. Let me give you some of the counter arguments that we've been sort of debating back and forth in the U.S. over the last few years. Probably the most sophisticated direct response to the points that Jason Furman made were from Gene Sperling, who worked for the Clinton, Obama, and Biden administrations, and has a piece in Democracy Journal that goes through especially the arguments around inflation and macroeconomics. And I would refer you to those points. But I think what the takeaway from Sperling's argument is that inflation was broadly in line with other OECD countries that were experiencing similar supply shocks due to COVID. And also that the US on unemployment performed quite better than many of the other countries, and in fact experienced the two lowest years of unemployment since 1969, and this coming on the heels of a economy-shattering pandemic. There's also, I think, been some debate around the why of the manufacturing focus of the Biden administration. Why focus on manufacturing instead of services or other, or just neutral economic activity? And I think the answer here is twofold. One is that there's a security and a geoeconomics dimension, a need to invest in the sectors where especially there's been high degrees of monopolization by China and other sort of single sources of supply like Taiwan. And that also, in the US context in particular, there was no substitute for an industrial policy-focused approach to fighting the climate crisis. The US had, over the years, much in the line with good economics advice, from the broad consensus of economics profession, there would sort of be a hierarchy of how to address climate. At the top would be carbon taxes, carbon pricing of some kind. Below that would be regulation, command and control type regulation. And then sort of a distant third might be subsidies to firms to engage in economic transformation. In the US context, we had seen a Supreme Court that was very hostile to the first two means of regulation. And it had also been about 15 years since the US had really attempted to do carbon pricing and was not able to get a vote in the US Senate. So you had a lot of folks that were sort of reluctant supporters of industrial policy in the US, kind of viewing that if you were going to have some kind of response to climate, it was going to go through that mechanism. As to the conditions and whether these were excessive, in general, we found that the industrial policy programs, whether it was the CHIPS office or the Clean Energy office, that these programs were oversubscribed. There was a lot more demand for them than there was funding to get out the door. And companies largely did not balk at the requirements. And indeed, government on the back end showed a fair amount of flexibility on tailoring some of the requirements to the programs in question and not sort of pursuing a sort of hard-headed enforcement of all these conditions, but viewing them more as guidelines. And this gave some flexibility to make sure that the speed of deployment wasn't getting in the way of sort of the comprehensiveness of these guardrails that were in place. And in particular, what we saw was a pattern of investment that the market on its own probably wouldn't have produced, which is 75% of clean energy investment going to counties, US counties below the median income, with especially strong growth in communities that had been previously reliant on fossil fuels, and in counties most adversely impacted by the China shock. And for folks that may not know this, the China shock refers to work by David Otter, Gordon Hanson, and co-authors that look at the disproportionate impact of the increase of Chinese imports on the manufacturing economies across the United States. And they find that there were certain communities that were very hard hit, that never really recovered, and then as a result also saw their local politics polarized in favor of sort of extreme right and in some cases extreme left. So those would be some of the responses to, was it effective? Now let's move to the second point. Was it popular? Was this middle-out economics popular? And I think especially in a European audience, this is a question I get a lot. I've been the last few days at conferences at University of Cambridge and IPPR looking at this question. And I think this is something that especially governments of the center left in Europe are looking at. Do they want to go down the path that Biden and Harris went down if in fact you're getting punished by voters? So this is certainly something we hear a lot here as a concern. And I think the few pieces of evidence that you could imagine would be in support of this view that it wasn't popular. Democrats in the U.S. lost the House in 2022. That Biden, when he was still in the race, was not favored to win re-election in 2024, and his chosen successor lost big to Donald Trump, including by Trump sweeping all 7 swing states and winning not only the Electoral College vote, which he had in 2016, but also the popular vote, barely. And then finally, that the working class voters of all races that were supposed to be the beneficiaries of this. That's my cue to wrap up. I will move along. The working class of voters of all races actually defected to Trump, and so shouldn't that have been the opposite if you were doing all these great things for working class voters through your policy? Let me just put this in a few pieces of context. One. This narrative that Biden's agenda was a political loser is sometimes at tension with another theme that's quite out there, which is that no one knew what Biden's economic policies were. So it's hard that you're being punished by voters, and also voters didn't understand what you were doing. But let's put that to the side. I think it's important to also put some of the electoral outcomes of the last few years in context. In the 22 midterm elections are the non-presidential elections every 2 years. From 1934 to 2018, in the U.S., the president's party averaged a loss of 28 House seats and 4 Senate seats. Under Clinton and Obama, this was even higher. So right after Clinton passes the North America Free Trade Agreement in 1993, he loses 54 House seats and 8 Senate seats, which was the worst performance at the time since the death of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Obama went even bigger and lost 63 House seats and 6 Senate seats. and then for good measure also 12 governorships and a whopping 958 state legislative seats over the course of his time in office. In contrast, Biden in 2022, in the first midterm elections after these pieces of legislation that I've described, lost only 6 seats in the House, so much fewer, and gained 1 seat in the Senate. This is unheard of in U.S. history. The incumbent party rarely achieves anything like this. And then if you look at some of the messages that these successful candidates were using, they were very much leaning into the set of industrial policies. John Fetterman, who picked up a seat for Democrats in the Pennsylvania, his election message, which I won't quote the entire thing for obscenity, but I will just say that he says, we don't need to outsource any more Pennsylvania jobs to China. Making more stuff in America brings jobs right here and fights inflation. And similar messages across the other successful candidates. Fast forwarding to 2024, there's a very similar story here in that Trump, while doing well in the presidential race, had effectively no coattails in the congressional votes. Democrats actually expanded their number of seats in the House relative to the outcome before. And in the Senate, where they did lose a number of seats, the Senate candidates in the states, this is the statewide races, did far better than Kamala Harris in almost every race, including by up to 14 points better in some of the key races. And one hypothesis here is that because industrial policy and a lot of the other middle-out economics is so place-based and so place-specific, that it's actually somewhat hard to develop a national message out of some of these kinds of policies. Whereas if you're a senator or a locally elected official, you can say, hey, this is a bridge in our community, this is a battery factory in our community, and able to make that the center of your message in a way that for presidents is just much harder with foreign policy and every other thing that you have to address. And I would just point out that the working class vote actually did do quite well for both Biden and Harris. And in fact, both Biden and Harris have improved over the union vote that had been going increasingly for Republicans. They reversed that in both instances better than the one before. I think the bigger takeaway here is just that the cost of living, and I think this is, we'll get into this in the panel, long-term investments are important. It's clear from some of the evidence that I've presented here, the Democrats weren't punished for some of these long-term investments, but neither were they excessively rewarded either. And that the voters really do care about cost of living, and that's the part of the middle-out economics agenda that didn't get a lot of traction policy-wise, did not get passed through the Congress. And then it's also important to communicate your vision consistently. We saw clearly with Biden struggles of a variety of kinds, but did not have a strong ability to communicate a vision of this Bidenomics message that bore his name. And then Harris actually went in somewhat of a different direction even from claiming this, neither distancing herself from the parts of Biden that were unpopular, nor really claiming as her own the parts that could have been more popular. And so I'll leave it there so that we have more chance to get into what comes next, over the course of the discussion. But I do think that, looking forward, we see in the U.S. that, in January 19 of this year, which was the day before Donald Trump's inauguration, a lot of the Washington and Beltway community in D.C. were discussing the problem that was top of the mind for a lot of analysts was what's going to happen when Donald Trump claims as his own all of these Biden investments, and he gets credit for it rather than Biden and the Democrats. I think that what we've seen in the last few months is a very different problem, which is what happens when they sabotage what could have been an electoral winner for themselves. We're seeing, in many government agencies, cuts of 30, 40, 50% of the headcount there. I think that whoever comes into office in 2028, 2029 is going to have to figure out a way to rebuild that. But I think that the hope and the promise, and hopefully we'll get into this in the conversation, is how to adopt a little bit of the Biden slogan, but how to build back better. How to make sure that these agencies are more effective at building in the real economy after decades of disinvestment. So with that, I'll stop there and look forward to the panel. Thank you.
That was terrific, Todd. It was almost as if you'd been preparing for it. I'm going to invite our next panelists on, Jane Green and Alfie Sterling. And while they're taking their seats, I'm just going to introduce very briefly. So Jane is the Professor of Political Science at Oxford University, Director of Nuffield Politics Research Centre, Co-Director of the British Election Studies. She's one of the UK's top experts on political behaviour, accountability in elections. From leading academic research to frontline election night analysis, she brings unmatched insight into how voters think, feel and decide. Alfie Sterling is the Director of Insight and Policy, leading the Evidence, Economics and Policy team at JHR. He's the Director of Research and Chief Economist at the New Economics Foundation, was Senior Economist at IPPR, leading macroeconomic and fiscal policy research for the Committee on Economic Justice. So, first of all, I'm going to ask you, you're going to have 2 minutes to respond to what you've heard from Todd. Jane, why don't you go first?
Alan does not believe I can do this in 2 minutes.
Go on.
So here's the challenge, right? Okay. So thank you, Todd. I think this was fascinating. The question, I think, so I first of all want to completely endorse what you said. You cannot say that Bidenomics was unpopular because of the election outcome. I also can't say it was popular because of some of the election outcomes too, right? So there's a very big difference in what happens in terms of the outcome and what explains the outcome. And that's because us human beings are incredibly complex in our perceptions and our beliefs that don't necessarily tally up with kind of patterns that we see in elections. So that's the first thing. The second thing I wanted to say is, could it be popular here? And I think I want to say one thing in favour of and one thing against. So one thing that I think was really, really exciting about this period of policy development was the scale of ambition. So if we think about what's really problematic in the UK in terms of our profound economic, societal and political challenges, one of the problems is this sense of the gravity of the problem not meeting the response of the moment. So we have a problem where expectations, a strange problem, that expectations are somewhat low and cynical. Trust in government to deliver is very low. And yet we also have this sense that there are unmet expectations, there are unmet promises, there are unmet clear challenges that aren't being addressed politically. And I think that was what was exciting to me, that there was a moment of stepping up to see the gravity and the scale of the challenge. So I think that could be popular. Because I think what voters in this country are really crying out for, and I'm not saying this is because I'm reading the tea leaves, right? We do a lot of survey research, and I can be delighted to talk about it. But it's this sense of, we just don't seem to think things are going to get better. And that's about the national economy. That's also about people's personal economic conditions. And that fear and those worries that people have, the economic insecurity that people feel, is a profoundly important sense of anxiety that people feel now. And that's tied to the expectation that things aren't going to get better. So I think meeting the moment is one of the crucial electoral parts of this puzzle. The second thing, however, is that gap between policy and people's beliefs and perceptions and feelings about what is actually happening to them. So we've been doing the reason I'm here is that we're working with Joseph Rowntree Foundation, helping the foundation to understand feelings of those experiences and feelings of economic insecurity across the country. We've also looked at this in the US too. And we see in the US that negativity around the economy was profound going into the last election. It was more profound even than in the UK. And even if you thought that that inflation was coming down, you weren't as likely to think that prices were going down too. So that's right, isn't it? That just because inflation was going down, prices were still going up. And it was much easier to see that prices were a problem, even if inflation was coming down. Around 40% of people, Paul, I think, talked about beyond GDP. Around 40% of people can't tell us if GDP is getting higher or getting lower, right? But it's those feelings that people, those worries that people have that are tied to the high cost of living, both in the US and in the UK, that are about prices. They're not about evaluations of whether inflation is going down necessarily. People are still feeling the pinch. They're feeling very acutely. They felt it more acutely in the US even than they do in the UK. So could it be popular? Yes. It's not just obviously about people seeing policies that are in their interest or could be in their group's interest. So a policy that's orientated to the working class, I think, is not broad enough. I think the silent majority of voters, both here and in the US, indeed we find this there too, is that it's the midlife group of individuals in this country who feel the most economically pressed. They lack the sort of buffers. They feel the most outgoings and the most pressure. So just a message to the working class is not going to be broad enough. So it has the potential to meet the moment. Obviously, we can argue about the policies themselves, but it's that disconnect between what people were feeling, how people were feeling pressured, and perhaps also a disconnect about who the Democrats were talking to that I think is part of the problem. And then, well, last thing, polarization and partisanship in America, right? So we cannot talk about the translation of American politics into the UK without noting that people saw the economy in the US predominantly through a partisan lens. That's not quite as true here, but it is true to some degree. So key differences if we're thinking about the politics, but really important lessons we can learn, I think.
Jane, one of the things that I think you feel excited about listening to Todd is the sort of scale and the ambition.
Yeah.
Thinking big.
Yeah.
Is there a sort of sense that in Britain now we think thinking big is no longer possible? That the economic straitjacket doesn't allow us to think big in the way that Todd was describing?
I certainly hear that being said. I don't know if it's true.
But he hasn't. They don't have the OBR in the United States.
But there's something. I mean, I don't feel particularly qualified to talk about, how you express a vision for this, right? I can talk about the symptoms and the problems. But there's a leadership question here, isn't there? There's a rhetoric question here. There's an ambition and a hope and a sense of coherence and strategy and a vision question, which I think is really important. And it's got to be realistic. There's no point promising the world. But I think this was what Bidenomics was doing. It was saying, we're going to be ambitious about this scale. It wasn't unrealistic. It wasn't ridiculous. And it also wasn't enough, right? Clearly it wasn't, nothing's ever going to fix everything, clearly. But I do think there are political options, even if they're still within a constrained envelope that perhaps are being missed out.
Okay, Jane slightly overshot her 2 minutes. So in
Sorry.
fact, you could have 3 minutes, Alfie.
Well, I was planning for 2.
All right, okay. Well,
Yeah,
you didn't do that.
No, thank you very much. 2 really interesting contributions. When I think about these questions from the more parochial vantage point of the UK perspective on our economy, policy, and the way that it's experienced and felt by families, there are sort of 3 facts that just sit in the back of my head, and I think that animate this conversation for me in the current moment. So the first is that on current projections in the UK, the average family is set to be about £700 worse off by the end of the Parliament in terms of their disposable income than they are today. The second fact is that is not an equal distribution either. So the poorest third of households are going to see their disposable income fall twice as fast as the middle and the top. And the final fact is that if those things come to pass, they are just forecasts. They're not ARC forecasts. They're the implications of forecasts by the Office of Budget Responsibility, the Bank of England. We've done work with others to look at what it means for families, which is where those facts come from. But if those phenomena come to pass, that would make this the first parliament on record, on modern record, where people were worse off by the end of the parliament than they were at the beginning. And I think if we just pause on that, those have big, powerful implications for politics, and it comes directly to this question of politics policy and the scale of the response. And I mean, there are obviously, we can get into this in the conversation, but there are clearly a myriad of factors and drivers that sit beneath that, both things that are within government control on the policy side and things that are outside of their control in the global economy or even the domestic economy, to be honest, that's outside the control of policymakers. But for me, if you were trying to, in 2 minutes, to distill as to what I think is the crux of the problem, and this is trying to think big, hopefully, is that we haven't sufficiently formalised the importance of the security and well-being economically of families, either as part of the desired direct outcome of an economy, or as a really important input into what we might think a healthy economy is, even if that's measured by other metrics. So it's insufficiently formalised in terms of how policymakers think about this, how the media discuss this, and therefore how people, debate, public, respond to these issues. And just to give a bit of flavour of what I mean on those two different elements. So from the point of view of inputs, the point of view of household economic security, economic well-being being a crucial input to the health of an economy. There's sort of well-rehearsed arguments around how household spending is critical to the health of an economy. That falls across in some ways what I've seen previously as Keynesian monetarist dividing lines, left-right dividing lines around demand, supply. But putting all that to one side, we actually know from the modern literature that the economic security of households is really important to the supply side of an economy as well. We've not seen a comprehensive putting together of putting a number on this, and it's some work actually that Chair would like to do, is looking at how can we strengthen the literature in this area. But we do know from existing literature that workers that feel more secure are more productive at work, all else being equal. We know that when people feel more secure, they're more likely to invest in themselves, their skills, in starting a business. And at a more macro level, we know that if you do things like you provide sufficient insurance, like in particular Social Security payments and the minimum income floor, the reservation wage as economists refer to it, you create a pressure for employers to provide better quality jobs, and you improve things like skills matching in the economy. So all these things are sit there in the current evidence base, but are rarely considered as an input to a strong and healthy economy. But turning them to outcomes, the goals of an economy, as we all know, the usual metrics by which economists and economic commentators and economic policymakers judge success are things like domestic output, GDP, inflation stability, the employment rate. Now, these things are clearly important, they're vital in many instances, but they are proxies for the thing that we're trying to get at here, which is the economic experience of households, which I would argue is both a superior endpoint for how you're trying to measure economy, but in the end, it's also crucial for politics. And just to bring this full circle, I mentioned families being £700 worse off on the OBR's forecast. That's based on survey data run through a model that uses these macro forecasts from the Bank of England and elsewhere. If you look not at survey data that is designed to measure living standards, but instead look at national accounts data, which is used to measure GDP, at the average, actually households are better off over the next 5 years, not worse off. And the reason for that gets back to this point about how our current metrics of success are not sufficient proxies, are not capturing the lived experience of the economy by all of us who live within it. And specifically in this case, it's because national accounts data does not fully capture costs that come onto that people experience, and in particular housing costs at the average are not fully captured. So if you think about disposable income after housing costs, because most people need a home and they can't go without one, and so that is a fixed cost, that eats out a chunk. And even more bizarrely in some respects, it comes down to these conceptual notions of what is income. And in a national accounts definition of GDP, this concept of imputed rent, whereby if you own the home that you live in, you are assumed that that home pays you an income. sufficient, equal to the rental value were you to have rented it out. So I'm not going to repeat that because it's not that important. But the point is, it's nonsense from the point of view of living standards. It's important economically if you're trying to measure output. It's nonsense from the point of view of living standards. And as I say, if you take those things out, families are worse off, not better off. And I think this disconnect sits at the crux of the policy challenge, the political challenge, and the economic challenge that we face.
Todd, do you want to react to anything you've heard from Jane and Alfie?
Yeah, I mean, and I think a common theme in both of the contributions, which is very well taken, is the importance of cost of living, and especially the types of metrics that either due to partisan polarization on the way we are consuming information, we may not be metabolizing some of the relevant statistics, or indeed, as you say, this relevant statistics may not be capturing the things that are most relevant for a quality of living perspective. I think in the US, we definitely saw this to be true. This was the number one concern of voters was the cost of living. And I think some of the things, I mean, I mentioned the long-term investments, I mentioned sort of the efforts to empower workers and make markets more competitive. I think all of these things are things that over the medium to longer term will help with cost pressures and affordability. I mean, after all, having clean energy that's manufactured and costs effectively zero to run a wind farm or a solar farm, much more cost effective for household budgets than the fluctuating price of fossil fuels. On the other hand, some of the things that the administration did to address short-term cost increases and try to have something that you could see over the short term were very difficult for voters to see. I mean, the thing that was probably most interventionist from a sort of classical economics perspective that the administration did was all of the managing of supply chains that happened after the COVID crisis, where you saw ports backed up, you saw, the highway crossings between the US and Canada shut down, you saw sort of baby formula shortages, you saw semiconductor shortages. And so the administration was on the phone nonstop with the port operators and the manufacturers in Indonesia, and sort of, was really, for the first time in US history, getting a hold of the supply chains that globalization has built. For the first time, government really getting its handle around this. The benefit of that is that it's the price increase you don't see, right? It's instead of your living cost or for a given commodity going up 50%, maybe it only goes up 5% or goes up 1%. That's great, but that's a hard thing to sell to voters. Voters are going to see what they can see, not what they can't see, and so that I think created some difficulties for the administration in really convincing voters that they had those cost of living issues at heart.
We've slightly overrun already, but everyone's been so fascinating. But looking around the audience, I can see so many people who are deeply fascinating in their own right. So I'm going to suggest we go straight to audience questions. And I know we've got some streaming there, but yeah, here's a hand here.
Yes, my name's Gavin Oldham. I'd like to ask you...
Can you just grab the microphone?
I'd like to ask you about the intense intergenerational unfairness which is going on at the moment. I mean, in the United States, you've got $36 trillion debt. Over here, we've got £2.7 trillion debt. And it's going to be our children and grandchildren who have to sort it out. But it's not just that. I mean, all the wealth is sitting with old people like me. Young people, it was Keith Joseph came out 50 years ago and spoke about breaking the cycle of deprivation. And it's far worse today than it was 50 years ago. Why can't we sort out our economics to recognize, that intergenerational rebalancing has to be part of it? And yet the economists, it's like the black hole of economics, because nobody has ever looked at tying up the human life cycle with the issue about passing wealth on from generation to generation. Government sucks it in and uses it on mending the roads and paying interest on the debt. What are we going to do for our young people?
Who would like to take that?
I'm happy to...
Have a go.
I'm happy to respond in the following way. I'm not sure, I can't say, here's what we should do about that. But what I would say is that what we've been speaking about is that GDP and household income are essentially myopic, impoverished ways of thinking about well-being. And I think what you're saying is the intergenerational fairness, the burden that's being placed on future generations, and indeed the concerns that older generations have for younger generations, and those issues of opportunity, where wealth is held intergenerationally, the fairness of prospects for younger generations coming into today's housing market, today's job market, but also these kinds of macroeconomic burdens, is recognised by the population. My only message really that I would, in response, is really just to endorse that these are concerns that I think are shared by the population. One of the important things about understanding economic insecurity, those feelings, is to help us move away from just perceptions of, just thinking about GDP or household income and whether or not how well off you feel, to thinking about intergenerational differences in the burdens being placed on families, but also perceptions and concerns that people have that are much broader for younger children, for older children, and so on and so forth. So we see, in actual fact, whilst it's true that there's a widespread perception that younger generations are indeed struggling more financially, there's a widespread perception that that's true, that those people that have adult children who are struggling financially are more likely to support policies that favour young adults. It's also the case that it's the midlife group who are feeling the greatest pinch now. So there's all sorts of intergenerational problems that we're experiencing, but you're completely correct to say that it's the older generation who, on average, are experiencing the least insecurity now. And that's another problem of just using income, because if you look at income, you'll see that older generations have lower incomes. And so that looks like a problem that we need to solve in policy terms, but in actual fact, that's ignoring wealth and assets. And it's the wealth and assets that younger generations can't acquire anything as easily as older generations did at the same age. So I'm sorry I don't have the answer to what are we going to do about this, but I can say that I think those concerns that you express are widely held concerns and could be very politically potent.
Let's have a question from the gentleman here. Yeah.
Titus Alexander, Democracy Matters. That was very interesting, and it seemed to me a lot of the issues arise from the political system. And I wonder whether you agree with that, and if so, how do we need to change the political system so that it can tackle these problems better?
I could take a stab at that. Yeah, so you've hit on an issue near and dear to my heart, which is democracy reform. And I think in the US context, whether you're looking at our Senate or our court system, or indeed any number of other US institutions, they're among the most counter-majoritarian in the developed world. And this is something that has been a problem and is set to be even more of a problem. If you look at sort of the power between the least represented citizen in the US Senate versus the most represented citizen, depending on what state they come from, the power asymmetry is about 70-1 right now. And if current projections for how climate is going to affect location of where people live in the United States is to continue over the next 100 years, we'll see that double. So we're a very counter-majoritarian system. We're getting worse over time, and that is limiting our ability to deal with any of these things, such as the debt that was just mentioned, but also climate. This is perhaps even a more significant intergenerational equity concern. And right now we are able to pass, it's amazing what the Biden administration was able to get passed through Congress, but it was a lot of hurdles and a lot of the things that could have been most beneficial for folks' lives, like access to childcare, increasing housing supply, some of the things that would deal with the cost pressures that we're talking about here, were unable to get through because of these sort of arcane parliamentary rules. So that is something that I think really for the US to figure out what comes next, especially after this kind of post-Doge Department of Government Efficiency's quote unquote efforts right now. We're going to have to be looking at rebuilding our political system as much as it is rebuilding the economy.
Joe, have you got a question online?
Yes, this is from Peter Whiting. It's asking whether the stable and fair foundation needs to have trust as a component and what that might look like, how you rebuild that.
Who wants to tackle trust?
How to rebuild trust?
Alfie.
Alfie's looking at me.
I was going to say a good one.
Really? Okay. Wow. I thought about this a lot, and I'm still struggling with the question of trust, because we know, once you break trust, you have to earn it, don't you? I mean, we know as human beings, like a reputation once lost is almost irreparably damaged. So what we're talking about here has got to be some kind of fresh start. It has to be some sort of sense of renewal. You have to have, something that breaks the mold, that causes people to at least, look again and try again. So that's a very simplistic way of thinking about this, but trust is a very multifaceted problem. So we've got problems of trust in institutions, we've got problems of trust in each other, social cohesion, how social cohesion is interrelated with inequality. We've got massive challenges here. They're cultural, they're political, they're societal, they're economic. But politically speaking, how do we trust our institutions again? How do we place faith in any kind of expectation or hope that things will get better? There has to be some sense of refreshing, some sense of change, some sense of something new and something bold and something different. That doesn't answer the question at all. That's just a lot of words that I can't then say, and this is the way to do it, I'm afraid. But, trust is...
It's a big question.
Extremely
Let's move on to Chris Hume at the front, has caught my eye. And there's a microphone coming your way, Chris.
Excellent. I'm slightly alarmed from what Todd was saying about the messages out of Bidenomics, because one of the things that I think is most noticeable in the last few weeks has been the potential for a Trump moment, rather like a Truss moment in the UK bond market. And it seems to me that a lot of this agenda needs to be shaped by the constraints on tax and spend. And we need to think of ways as progressives of how to deal with these big issues in a way that is not just old-fashioned New Deal, FDR, tax and spend. Because it seems to me that inevitably means more spend, sorry to sound like Larry Summers, more spend, less tax, and big potential problems with the bond market.
Sure, I'll offer a few thoughts. One, I think that it is important to note that all of these pieces of legislation were more than paid for. This kind of gets to the debt question as well, by increasing IRS investigations, IRS capacity, as well as corporate taxation. So this was, deficit positive. And so, despite the very significant magnitudes, that was one piece of it. I think also you're looking at crowding in 6-to-1 of private capital to public capital. So a lot of the benefit here was the signal that the public investment sent to the private sector as to where to focus its spending. To give just kind of one example, the Loan Programs Office of the Department of Energy, sure, they cut a check to some promising new technologies, but the big factor in these loans is not the size of the loan, it's the technical seal of approval that these expert physicians, physics experts, energy experts are demonstrating to promising new technologies. And I think that's kind of an undersung part, and maybe also I undersung it today in terms of the strategy here, that it was, as the administration would often say, private sector, government-enabled, private sector-led. So really this was overwhelmingly a private sector activity with just a little bit of government pointing the direction.
Question there, right next door to the microphone.
Thanks. A quick preliminary in follow-up to your question. I do wonder why, in this day and age, the bond markets have such power over us. I'm sure there's a very good argument for it, but it seems slightly bizarre and anti-democratic. But my real question is, bearing in mind the disappointments and the losses and the, in some case, hardship of the population in terms that you've been speaking of, I'm interested in the sidestep in those circumstances to believing in charlatans, frauds, mistruth, disinformation, deliberate lying and games playing. And I'm wondering where the solution to that might come from. It doesn't seem to be education. Is it a problem with a lack of, I don't know whether one's allowed to say this, but a lack of innate sharpness? Can it be taught, this kind of discrimination? Or is the answer a well-intentioned, truly, well-intentioned and good, truly charismatic leader?
Alfie, you've been quiet for a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think political leadership is crucial to this, because I think if you want to go big and you want to address the scale of some of the issues we face, you have to have a political mandate to do that. And that process of building a political mandate has many elements. Leadership isn't all of it, but it is certainly a big one, and I think it's lacking across the political spectrum, actually, in terms of, with respect to at least some of the questions we've been talking about this evening. I did just want to come back on a couple of the other questions as well, because this point about bond markets, I mean, you raised it, and it was obviously in Chris's question. I think it's important to note that we don't actually really know what the scope of fiscal sustainability is, what the scope of fiscal space is at any given point in time. So it's a bit of a shibboleth that hangs over policymakers, but without a sort of a particular science to it. You know, we tend to have quite spurious precision in the things we mark up, like debt and deficits, but not genuine accuracy in how we're capturing the dynamics of what drives fiscal sustainability of countries. So almost your starting point should be, let's have a framework that properly proxies and captures what fiscal space there is. And, you know, even if you go and talk to financial traders, different parts of the bond market, you'll get very different responses. Some people will say, well, look, it's nothing to do with debt and borrowing. They're not the thing we worry about. We worry about the fundamentals of the economy, whether that's some of the metrics I was talking about as being poor proxies, or actually some of the metrics I would care more about, like living standards, more broadly. Some would say, no, actually, what we really care about isn't that, and it's not debt or borrowing. It's the near-term volume of debt issuance coming onto the market over the next 6 to 12 months. Government isn't targeting that either, but that's actually the thing that is occupying people's minds. And others say, no, it is the fiscal rules, because government tell us that's important. They tell us that's what they're aiming for, and therefore it's a totem of credibility. But the idea that this is a fixed scientific constraint and one that isn't partly within the gift of policy to tackle, I think leads us to a problem which comes back to, why don't we think big? Why is it the politics of managerialism across countries and across time hasn't delivered some of the answers to this stuff? I think that's part of the issue we have to tackle.
Gentlemen here, if you could get the microphone over there.
Thank you very much. Rudy Bogni, given that the political discourse has moved from the end of history to war is possible, what do you think would happen if continental or even global war were to happen? Would the conversation of tonight get frozen? Would we go back to the post-World War I very flexible movement in thinking and in reivindication? Or would it be like post-World War II, where the world tries to resettle in various ideologies, but without any real fundamental movement in either bloc?
Big question. I think one of the interesting things of the last few years has been the ways in which these external shocks and possibility of war, possibility of international conflict has broadened the sense of what's possible in domestic policy. I remember around the time of, it was a very long year between Biden in 2021 introducing some of the policies that he was after, and the middle of 2022 when it was finally passed by Congress in a very different form. One of the things that changed over that time period was concern over energy shocks, and especially sort of geopolitically induced concern about energy shocks. And I think that this also, if you fast forward for the last few years, I mean, it's been impressive in the last couple of months from a U.S. perspective that the U.S. has often requested European allies, for instance, to spend more on defense and spend more on their domestic industry and spend more on infrastructure. And all of a sudden, you see all of these changes happening that folks thought were impossible in normal times, whether that's sort of constitutional change in Germany, whether that's more spending here, whether that's changes in Canada and sort of other countries. And so I think that, we're going to be in a period of extended geopolitical destabilization due to climate, due to international conflict, and the ways that these feed each other. And I think it's going to continue to change the parameters of how we think about our domestic policy and what is possible, and what looked like financially irresponsible in normal times might look financially responsible in these times.
Okay.
I need to say something positive, I think. I think, so with saying first a negative. So one negative is that obviously this is going to make people poorer. I mean, that's just, Alfie's projections based on his £700 for households is going to get worse. I read just yesterday if China attacks Taiwan, then that is a bigger global economic shock than COVID or anything we've seen with Ukraine. Right? So that's the bad part. So here, what would be a more optimistic framework? Like, how can we think about what people really need and how moments of crisis can perhaps place political will on the kinds of things that really benefits household security, but also a broader sense of macroeconomic stability? And I think without kind of going too far off my kind of knowledge base, I just want to say two things. And that's everything we're really talking about is about buffers and insurance. You see this, the reason why our economy is so exposed to global economic instability is that we're so interreliant in the global trade relationships, but also on oil. We saw this with Putin's invasion of Ukraine, that what this should be telling us is to build resilience, to build buffers, to build insurance as a country. What that means for households is that same sense of buffer, that same sense of insurance is what people are going to be crying out for. So do they want a more generous welfare state? Well, of course, they're going to need a more generous welfare state. Who are the people that are going to require that the most? Well, they're going to be the poorest, but they're also going to be families with the greatest sense of burdens and the lack of their own buffers. So what we see in our research is that having savings, having a secure job, having fewer outgoings that are less reliant, less unpredictable. So if you have savings, if you don't have unsecured debt, if you have a secure job, if you think that the state will protect you if you need it, then you're more likely to have that sense of security. So I think, everything in my mind points to a political response to difficult times as a greater sense of insurance and provision, a safety net, both at the macroeconomic level and also at the household level. And that's certainly what our data is telling us that people want to see.
I'm very conscious I've been unfair to this side of the room, so thank you.
Hi, I'm Peter West. Just going back to the first speaker, if he thinks that the older generation have done really well compared to the younger people, he hasn't been asked to look after the grandchildren as much as I have. Todd, I thought your talk was fantastic. It was really interesting, and I didn't realise how much good stuff Biden had done. And I found that quite positive and quite encouraging until I realised that actually he got a good kicking for it. So what are politicians over here going to take from that? I mean, even if they could afford that sort of gesture, if they're going to get a kicking for it afterwards, is that going to help? So I don't know if what is the answer? Is it tariffs that Trump says, or is it a different electoral policy? But people talk about proportional representation, and then you see the problems they have in Germany and Holland today. So pick any one of those questions.
Yes. Look, I think with a different electoral system, you would have the discussion we would be having would be very different today. It would be actually the Democrats did great and they were rewarded by an overwhelming majority of the country. But I mean, unfortunately, because of our electoral system, you suppress the vote in your most populous states. So I think most of California would have gladly gone out for their former senator Kamala Harris, but there's no point in voting in a lot of these states. So I think you would have seen a different electoral outcome and also a different shape of policy. As I was alluding to earlier, you might have seen more attention to pocketbook issues in the shape of the policy and not just these long-term climate investments. I think that would have led to a different outcome. But absolutely no question about it that focusing only on this long-term investment and not on the immediate cost of living issues was a real liability. And people living paycheck to paycheck, don't have patience for something that might yield fruit only in sort of the 10-year frame of a lot of these industrial policy investments.
Yeah, just on this point, I think that there are two sort of big retail political lessons that politicians have in their mind in the UK context at the moment. One is, it's already mentioned, the Liz Truss moment. Is that an example of us exceeding or breaching our fiscal space, and are we right up against that, and what might be the risks of that happening again? And the other is the Biden effect. Biden attempted to do a lot of these things and wasn't rewarded. Obviously, we've talked about the extent to which you can associate the two, but that is still a retail political lesson that politicians hold. And in particular, it constrains and binds, as Chris was saying, on the tax and spend side. But I think that where there is perhaps cause for optimism, and I think that I personally think that you can do things on tax and spend side still, partly on the fiscal space question, also actually on tax. There are a number of things a government could do without going against its manifesto commitments that are important and strong for the economy in terms of being pro-growth, because they get rid of inefficiencies and would actually raise revenue as well. But put all of that to one side, I think there's a debate there. There are other levers that government can intervene on. I think, broadly speaking, if you're trying to think about the lived experience of the economy and improving living standards, you have two broad types of approach. One is cross-market intervention, and that is in the tax and spend space, and where you basically move resources across the economy, across the markets, and you spend on safety nets or public services. But the other one is within market interventions, and it's a set of levers that haven't been pulled in a UK context. They weren't pulled at all over the last few decades until very recently during COVID, but in the last century were used quite a lot. But where you think about what is the regulatory framework that around the prices that people pay, the distribution and cross-subsidy between consumers or between producers and consumers. And if you think about some of the elements of the basket, if you like, the households that are most important, utilities are huge, and these are already monopolistic markets that are highly regulated. In the case of energy, for example, we already have a regulated price regime. There are some really quite powerful things you could do to intervene on price, to make this more progressive, to redistribute living standards and spending power in terms of how we spend energy. Social tariff, rising block tariff, there are a number of different options. Another big example is housing, where a number of countries have shown already that you can regulate to improve the quality, affordability and access of housing, irrespective of supply. And in the UK context, again, there is the example of childcare, where the state already puts in a significant subsidy on childcare, worth billions of pounds, but is not very well distributed from the point of view of either living standards, reducing inequality, or actually supporting people getting back into work. It's not targeted effectively to that end. So even putting aside the tax and spend debate, I think there are a lot of avenues that policymakers could pursue, and that gives us cause for optimism, I think.
Jane, you may have the last word.
Oh, thank you. If one were to take lessons from the US and immediately apply them to any other context, the first thing you have to do is think about the unique features in the US that made it possible for the election outcome, right? So we can argue about, I personally don't believe that Biden was punished for this, right? But let's just say why, if he was, what were the factors that would need to be different, right? One is you have to see people's evaluations of the economy in the US through partisan terms. Utterly different beliefs about the economy. Not just because of a partisan bias, not just because people wear these little rose-tinted or dark-coloured spectacles. People were hearing completely different things about what was happening in the economy and why. So that doesn't translate. That's number one thing. It's not the same here. The second thing is that this wasn't, I think, an insufficiently broad electoral coalition. that was being marketed, talked about, whatever you want to talk about, right? So I think broader is better if you wanted to try to transpose these kinds of ideas into a different context, such as in the UK. And the third thing we've talked about is that those feelings about insecurity, those worries about prices remained. And so, in a low inflation context, such policies might have been more successful. So we have to just think, what were the unique factors that meant, if it was the reason Harris, Biden lost the election, and I still would debate that, they're not necessarily the same. And therefore we shouldn't write off the agenda. If that's what you believe, I'm not necessarily advocating for it, but I think, whatever your political philosophy, you can't just, say, well, that was the outcome there and therefore it couldn't work elsewhere.
You've been a great panel. There are drinks upstairs. Sorry to close it off, but we've already run 10 minutes over. Thank you to JRF. Mingle upstairs, continue the discussion, pick up a copy of Prospect on your way out, and see you at the next one. Thank you. Thank you to the panel.